The sky was alive with chaos. Black blossoms of flak erupted around the formation, leaving dirty clouds that hung like bruises against the pale afternoon. Below them, the fields of northern Germany stretched out in a patchwork of greens and grays, but no one in the crew of the B-17 Lucky Lady had time to notice the landscape. The bomber shuddered with every near miss, its aluminum skin rattling under the concussive shock waves. They had been hit twice already, once in the starboard wing, and once near the bomb bay. And now, with one engine coughing smoke and another running hot, they were falling behind the main group. It was the worst possible place to be. At the very back of the plane, sealed in a plexiglass dome no larger than a phone booth, James read, Halpern watched the contrails above dissolve into chaos. 19 years old and barely 5'7", Halpern had been assigned to the tail gun because of his size and steady hands. He had left a wheat farm in Kansas less than a year earlier, trading tractor grease for twin .50 caliber Brownings and a view of the world that few men would ever see. The tail position was the loneliest seat in the sky, the last line of defense, and the first to die if things went wrong. Now, as the bomber lost altitude and drifted out of formation, every instinct told him that things were about to go very wrong. Bandits, 6 o'clock high. The warning crackled through the intercom from the top turret. Halpern swung his guns upward, his breath fogging the cold glass as he searched the horizon. Then he saw them, a cluster of dark specks growing larger by the second, slicing through the thin October clouds with predatory precision. Messerschmitt Bf 109s. There were at least 8, maybe more, flying in a loose V formation that spoke of experience. They had been waiting for a straggler like this. The first tracer round streaked past the tail, glowing orange as they zipped by and vanished into the void. Halpern squeezed the triggers, feeling the vibrations surge through the turret as his Browning spat back a defiant burst. He knew the odds. A crippled B-17, separated from the group, was an easy kill. The Luftwaffe pilots had done this hundreds of times, swooping in from the rear, overwhelming a lone bomber with coordinated passes, then pulling away before escort fighters could respond. Halpern had seen what happened to other stragglers. The wreckage usually spiraled down trailing smoke, and the parachutes that bloomed beneath were too few to count. Inside the fuselage, the crew worked frantically to keep the Lucky Lady aloft. The navigator shouted new course corrections. The engineer struggled with a damaged fuel line. The pilot, Lieutenant Charles Whitaker, kept his hands locked on controls, his jaw clenched as he tried to coax altitude out of a dying engine. The intercom buzzed with clipped, anxious voices. But in the rear, the noise faded to a distant hum. Halpern's world narrowed to the view through his twin gun sights, a strip of sky, a line of approaching fighters, and the seconds ticking away before they opened fire. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale like he'd been taught. Panic was death. Clear thinking kept you alive. He tracked the lead fighter through his sights, calculating speed and angle, but something in his gut told him that simply firing wasn't going to be enough. They were outnumbered and alone. His ammunition was limited. If he fought them conventionally, they'd tear the Lucky Lady apart before they even reached the North Sea. The Messerschmitts began to spread out, preparing for the kill run. Halpern watched their movements carefully, studying the subtle dips of their wings, the way they positioned for a coordinated attack. They were confident, maybe too confident. And in that moment, as tracers zipped past and flak burst thudded below, a strange calm settled over him. He remembered something one of his instructors had said during gunnery school back in Florida. A tail gunner doesn't just shoot. He talks to the enemy without words. Every move you make tells them something. Make sure they hear the story you want them to believe. Halpern tightened his grip on the handles, an idea forming that no training manual had ever covered. If he couldn't outgun them, maybe he could outthink them. Maybe, just maybe, he could make them believe something that wasn't true. He glanced at the ammunition belts coiled beside him, the rows of spent casings pooling at his feet. They had enough for one good fight, but if he played it differently, he might not need to fight at all. The B-17 lurched as another shell burst nearby, showering the fuselage with shrapnel. A warning light blinked red on the instrument panel up front. They were running out of time. Halpern took one last steadying breath, then began to move his turret. not in the usual smooth arcs of defensive sweep, but in sharp, unpredictable bursts. His guns barked out short, erratic bursts, then fell silent. He shifted positions rapidly, aiming at empty sky, firing at nothing, to the approaching German pilots. It might look like more than one gun was alive back here. It might even look like something else entirely. And as the first fighters closed within firing range, Halpern began the trick that would, in the minutes to come, make hardened Luftwaffe veterans question what they were really up against, and convince more than one of them to break off and turn back before they ever fired a shot. James Halpern had grown up on a flat stretch of Kansas farmland where the horizon seemed to stretch forever, and the loudest sound on most days was a hum of cicadas or the steady churn of a tractor engine. He had been called Red since grade school, a nod to the stubborn patch of auburn hair that refused to darken with age. His world had been simple then: rows of wheat to tend, fence lines to mend, and a handful of radio programs that brought news of distant battles into a kitchen that still smelled of kerosene and baking bread. He was neither a scholar nor a dreamer, just a practical boy with calloused hands and a talent for making broken things work again. By 17, he could rebuild a carburetor from memory and diagnose an engine problem by ear alone. Those skills seemed small in a world at war, but they would later become part of what made him invaluable 25,000 feet above enemy territory. When he enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1943, he did so quietly, without the dramatic speeches or tearful farewells other boys made. His older brother was already in Italy with the infantry, and Halpern had no illusions about glory. What drew him to the air was something simpler: the promise of doing a hard, necessary job in a machine that depended on every man aboard. The recruiting officer had glanced at his wiry frame and steady gaze and written gunner next to his name without hesitation. It was not a glamorous role. Gunners with a thin skin between the bomber crew and the fighters that hunted them, and tail gunners, perched alone at the farthest end of the aircraft, were often the first targets and the first casualties. Training was a brutal initiation into that reality. At gunnery school in Laredo, Texas, Halpern spent long days hunched over .50 caliber Brownings until his arms ached and his ears rang from the endless rattle of live fire. Instructors barked commands over the roar of engines as students fire at cloth banners towed by other planes, learning to lead a target moving faster than any truck or deer they had ever seen. They studied range estimation, ammunition types, and deflection shooting until the numbers blurred together. But it wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about surviving the chaos of real combat, when tracers streaked past and seconds meant life or death. They practiced in mock turrets barely big enough to sit in, so that new gunners would understand what awaited them in the field. A bubble of aluminum and glass, so tight you could barely shift your weight. A space so cold at altitude that frost formed on the guns. There was no standing room, no space to stretch, no way to escape once the mission began. A tail gunner sat alone, facing backward, watching death approach from the distance. His world was defined by a narrow strip of sky and the knowledge that every enemy fighter would aim for him first. The casualty statistics were an open secret at gunnery school. Crews heard them whispered at night in the barracks, that tail gunners had a life expectancy measured in weeks, that the 8th Air Force's losses over Germany were so high that some units replaced entire crews every month. More than 26,000 airmen would be killed over Europe before the war's end, a number that haunted every man who climbed aboard a bomber. Halpern listened to the stories but did not dwell on them. He learned early that fear could paralyze, but preparation could steady the hands. By the time he reached England in the winter of 1944, he was a different young man than the one who had left Kansas. The boy who once measured time by harvest seasons now measured it by mission counts. He had memorized the sound of his gun's cycling rate, could reload blindfolded, and had learned the peculiar discipline of men who sit in silence while death hurtles toward them at 400 miles an hour. He understood that his job was not just to shoot. It was to keep watch, to ward his crew of danger, and to buy them seconds they might not otherwise have. The tail turret AB 17 was no place for the faint-hearted. To climb into it, Halpern had to crawl past the waist gun positions, lower himself into a rotating shell just big enough to contain his body, and strap himself in so tightly that even turning his head required effort. Once there, He was sealed off from the rest of the crew, alone with his thoughts, the cold, and the distant shapes that might mean death. It was a place where time slowed, where seconds stretched into eternities, and where instinct and training blurred into one. For Halpern, that small space became a strange kind of home. He learned to read the sky like a book, the glint of sunlight off a wingtip, the subtle arc of an approaching interceptor, the brief puff of exhaust that revealed an enemy climbing into attack position. His world was reduced to angles, distances, and reaction times. And yet, in that isolation, he found a fierce sense of purpose. He was a man in the last seat, the one who would see danger first and often face it alone. Every life aboard the Lucky Lady depended, in part, on how quickly he recognized that danger and how cleverly he could meet it when it came. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was never designed to fight alone. Its designers had imagined it as part of a larger flock, a machine whose strength came not from speed or maneuverability, but from discipline and cooperation. Each bomber was a flying gun platform, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns mounted in turrets, windows, and hatches. But a single fortress isolated from its formation was a lumbering target, slow, predictable, and vulnerable. The key to its survival over occupied Europe was a combat box, a carefully engineered formation that turned a collection of individual aircraft into a single, interlocking weapon system. The combat box was a masterpiece of geometry and doctrine. A standard heavy bomber group consisted of dozens of B-17s arranged in staggered layers of altitude and spacing, each positioned to cover the blind spots of its neighbors. The lead element set the pace and direction, while the following elements flew slightly higher or lower, to the left or right, creating overlapping arcs of defensive fire. This formation allowed gunners from different planes to weave a deadly lattice of machine gun fire that no attacking fighter could pass through without risk. A Luftwaffe pilot approaching from behind might find himself in the sights of 3 or 4 tail gunners at once, while a frontal assault will be met with a concentrated wall of fire from nose and top turrets across the group. But flying in a combat box was a test of nerve and precision. The bombers were heavy, unresponsive aircraft, often loaded with 5,000 pounds of explosives and fuel enough for a 1,000-mile round trip. They lumbered through the air at little more than 150 miles per hour, unable to maneuver aggressively without breaking formation. Pilots flew so close that the wingtips of neighboring aircraft were often less than 100 feet away. One miscalculation could lead to mid-air collisions, catastrophic explosions, or a break in the formation that exposed the entire group to enemy attack. Yet when flown correctly, the combat box was a fortress in the sky, a moving citadel that could deliver thousands of pounds of bombs deep into enemy territory and, with luck, bring its crews home again. The Luftwaffe understood this, and their tactics evolved to exploit every weakness. Early in the campaign, German pilots had attacked from the rear, believing that the slower bombers would be easy prey. They quickly learned otherwise. Tail gunners, perched in their cramped glass bubbles, had the best field of view and some of the longest engagement times. Their twin Brownings could spit over 1,000 rounds per minute, and a disciplined gunner could cripple a fighter before it even reached effective firing range. By 1943, German squadrons began favoring head-on attacks, diving through the formation from above and firing as they passed. It was a terrifying tactic. Fighters closing at a combined speed of more than 500 miles per hour, firing cannons and machine guns in a single blistering pass before breaking away. Later, the Luftwaffe refined their approach even further. They attacked in coordinated waves, with one group drawing fire from the bomber's front, while others swept in from the flanks or below. Heavy twin-engine fighters like the Bf-110 and Ju-88, equipped with 20mm and 30mm cannons, targeted bombers from beyond the reach of defensive fire, often using air-to-air rockets to break up formations. For every tactic the Americans developed, the Germans countered with one of their own. It became a deadly chess match fought in 3 dimensions, with lives measured in seconds and meters. In this aerial war of attrition, the tail gunner's role remained uniquely vital. Positioned at the bomber's most vulnerable point, he was the first to see enemy fighters closing from behind, the classic 6 o'clock high approach, and often the last line of defense when the formation was broken. His job was not just to shoot, but to warn. A calm, accurate call from the tail could give waist gunners time to prepare, top turrets time to rotate, and pilots time to make subtle course adjustments that threw off an attacker's aim. The psychological burden was immense. Tail gunners knew that if they failed, the fighters would reach the bomber's soft underbelly or the engines that kept it aloft. They also knew that the Luftwaffe targeted them deliberately, aiming cannon bursts directly into the tail section to silence the guns and blind the crew. Many died before they ever fired a shot, yet the difference a skilled tail gunner could make was enormous. Crews told stories of missions where a single man's shooting had driven off multiple attackers, or forced a veteran German ace to break off his run. By 1944, missions deep into Germany were battles of endurance more than precision. Each raid required hours of formation flying under constant threat. Each return led a desperate push to nurse damaged aircraft home over the North Sea. Losses were staggering. As many as 1 in 5 bombers failed to return on some missions. But those that did often owed their survival to the unseen figures crouched in the tail, eyes fixed on the empty sky, waiting for first glint of aluminum that meant death was coming. In those final moments, when the swarm closed in and the fortress braced itself against the inevitable, the man in the last seat could make the difference between a smoking crater in a foreign field and the long, cold flight back to England. The air war over Europe had evolved into something far more complex than a simple contest of speed and firepower. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had refined its interception tactics into a deadly choreography, a dance in which every maneuver was designed to exploit the strengths and weaknesses of the American bomber formations. The days when German pilots would simply charge at the heavy bombers from behind and spray them with machine gun fire were long gone. Experience, often paid for in blood, had taught them that brute force was wasteful. To bring down a B-17 Flying Fortress, a pilot had to think like a hunter, anticipate the prey's moves, and strike where the defenses were weakest. One of the most feared tactics was the head-on attack. It required immense nerve and precision. Messerschmitt Bf-109s or Focke-Wulf FW-190s would climb high above the bomber stream, then dive straight down the formation's nose, closing the distance at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. The approach was terrifying for the crews. The fighters flashed toward them like spears, firing their cannons in brief, violent bursts before banking away at the last possible moment. The nose gunners and pilots tried desperately to track them, but the closing speed left only seconds to react. A well-executed head-on pass could cripple a bomber in a single strike, ripping to the cockpit bomb bay or forward fuselage before the gunners even had time to adjust their aim. When frontal attacks proved too costly or too predictable, the Luftwaffe shifted to beam attacks, high-speed passes from the left or right flank. These were timed to exploit the momentary blind spots between waist gunners and top turrets, forcing the Americans to coordinate their fire under immense pressure. The fighters approached on converging paths, often rolling their aircraft at the last second to present a narrower target profile. They fired as they streaked across the formation, then climbed back into sun, ready to repeat the maneuver. The beam attacks were difficult to counter because they targeted the weakest points in the bomber's defensive coverage. A single burst from a 20mm cannon could sever a wing spar, ignite a fuel tank, or shred a control surface. But the most relentless of all were the coordinated rear assaults. This tactic played directly into the tail gunner's world, a nightmare of angles and timing. Instead of attacking one by one, German fighters approached in layered waves, each carefully spaced to saturate the defensive fire. The first wave would draw the bomber's attention, forcing the tail and waist gunners to open up as they reloaded or cooled their barrels. A second wave would sweep in from slightly different angles. A third might dive from above, while another climbed from below. The result was a constant, rotating pressure that exhausted ammunition, overheated barrels, and pushed the gunner's reflexes to the limit. Luftwaffe pilots were quick studies in psychology as well as aerodynamics. They noticed how American gunners tended to panic and fire too early, wasting precious rounds before the fighters were in range. They watched how a bomber crew's aim faltered after a near miss, how traces became erratic when a plane started to take hits. They even learned to use feints, sending a single fighter on a mock approach from one direction to draw fire while the real attack came from another. It was a cat-and-mouse game fought at 25,000 feet, where patience and misdirection could be deadlier than any weapon. The cumulative effect was devastating. Attrition rates climbed steadily throughout 1943 and 1944. Missions deep into Germany, to targets like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, or Berlin, often cost 1 in 5 bombers. A single raid could see dozens of aircraft go down in flames, their crews parachuting into captivity or vanishing entirely. The Luftwaffe was taking losses too, but they had one crucial advantage. They dictated the terms of engagement. They could choose when and where to strike, and their evolving tactics meant they often inflicted disproportionate damage, even when outnumbered. By the spring of 1944, American crews understood that they were being outthought as well as outgunned. The massive industrial power behind the 8th Air Force could build more planes and train more men, but could not erase the cold reality that every mission was a duel of minds. The German pilots were adapting faster than anyone had anticipated, turning their intimate knowledge of the bomber's vulnerabilities into lethal precision. Gunners began to dread certain patterns in the sky. The widening arc of fighters splitting into flanks, the sudden climb that heralded a beam pass, the eerie stillness before a frontal dive. Each sign was a harbinger of another deadly pass. Even the most experienced crews admitted privately that they were fighting an enemy who understood them too well. Every habit, every instinct, every standard operating procedure had been studied, cataloged, and turned against them. The B-17's strength lay in its predictability, but predictability was also its greatest weakness. As the summer wore on and the raids pushed deeper into the Reich, it became clear that brute endurance would not be enough. If the bomber offensive was to succeed, someone, somewhere in the formation, would have to start thinking as creatively as the men trying to shoot them out of the sky. The order came down on a gray, windless morning in March 1944. By the time the crews of the 100th Bomb Group filed into the drafty briefing room at Thorpe Abbott's, word of the target had already circulated across the base. Rumors were part of the ritual, men guessing at objectives as they sipped bitter coffee from tin mugs and tugged at the collars of their sheepskin jackets. But when the curtain at the front of the room was finally pulled aside and the red string traced its path deep into the heart of central Germany, the murmurs died away. Magdeburg, a sprawling complex of aircraft assembly plants and engine works, one of the Reich's most vital industrial centers, deep in enemy territory, ringed by flak batteries, and well beyond the range of escort fighters for most of the mission. It was exactly the kind of raid that could change the course of the war, or erase an entire bomb group from existence. Halpern sat near the back, his notebook balanced on his knee, pencil hovering over the page. The briefing officer spoke in clipped, practiced tones as he described the route, the rendezvous points, and the expected resistance. German radar coverage would pick them up before they reached the Rhine. Heavy flak concentrations around Munster, Brunswick, and Magdeburg itself. At least 2 Jagdgeschwader fighter wings operating in the region, veterans, most of them, who knew the American formations as well as the men flying them did. Expect contact after the IP, the officer said, referring to the initial point for the bomb run, probably before. By the time the briefing ended, the room was heavy with silence more honest than any speech. Each man knew the odds. Deep penetration raids were statistically brutal, often 20% losses or more, and this one was deeper than most. Some folded the mission maps into their flight suits without a word. Others smoked in silence or tried to crack jokes that no one laughed at. Halpern went through his pre-mission rituals mechanically, checking his sidearm, packing extra gloves, double-checking his heated suit connections. In the tail position, a malfunction at altitude could freeze a man solid in minutes. The first engines roared to life in the dark hours before dawn, sending waves of exhaust steam curling into the night. The ground crews moved like shadows under the winged giants, tightening bolts, loading belts of ammunition into gun mounts, and sealing bomb bay doors around their deadly cargo. Lucky Lady was near the front of the taxi line, her olive-drab fuselage streaked with frost and soot. Halpern climbed aboard to the narrow hatch under the belly, ducking past the waist gun positions and crawling into the tail turret, his home for the next 10 hours. He tightened the shoulder harness, ran his gloved fingers over the cool steel of the Brownings, and stared out into the pre-dawn gloom. Takeoff was always the most deceptive part, a brief illusion of peace before the violence ahead. The bomber lifted into the sky with a heavy groan, climbing steadily as the formation assembled over the English countryside. One by one, the groups merged into a single column of silver dots stretching eastward into the rising sun. The first hours passed in monotony, the engines droning in perfect rhythm, the cold creeping into every seam of the aircraft. Halpern watched the landscape below shift from hedgerows and farmland to the gray-blue smear of the North Sea. Somewhere beyond that water, hundreds of German pilots were checking their own planes, loading their cannons, and waiting for the radar stations to sound the alarm. Crossing the Dutch coast, the formation tightened, the chatter on the intercom growing more frequent. Report of enemy activity filtered through. Small formations of Bf 109 seen climbing near Bremen. Flak bursts spotted near Emden. Halpern checked and rechecked the sights, scanning the empty sky behind them. Hours of tension piled atop one another until time seemed to stretch. The horizon remained empty, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They hit the Rhine under a canopy of black puffs. Flak batteries on the ground firing blind at the formation. The bomber rocked violently as shells exploded nearby, the shock waves slamming against the fuselage like invisible fists. Fragments clattered against the skin of the aircraft, leaving small dents and scratches. Inside the turret, Halpern steadied his breath and scanned for movement. The fighters always came after flak. As the sun climbed higher, Germany's industrial heartland unfolded below them. Rail lines, factory roofs, and rivers snaking through the landscape. The IP was only minutes away now. The bomb bay doors began to open, the bombardiers preparing their sights. Then, faint at first but unmistakable, came the voice over the intercom. Bandits. Hi, 8 o'clock. More at 3. Halpern swung his turret around, his heart hammering as he peered into the distance. Tiny black dots, growing larger by the second, were cutting through the sky toward them. This was no probing skirmish. It was a coordinated interception. Dozens of German fighters, climbing fast and closing in. The long, tense hours of flight were over. The mission that would define his place in the war was about to begin. And in the minutes ahead, every decision he made would determine whether Lucky Lady ever saw English skies again. The Ruhr Valley stretched beneath them like a wound in the earth, a sprawl of factories, refineries, and steel mills pumping smoke into the late morning sky. This was Germany's industrial heart, and every bomber crew in the formation knew it. The flak here was heavier, thicker, more accurate than anywhere else they had flown. The Luftwaffe defended the Ruhr with a ferocity that bordered on fanaticism, and no mission that passed through this airspace was ever routine. By the time Lucky Lady and the rest of the 100 bomb group crossed the Rhine, the radios were alive with warnings. Radar stations in Holland and Belgium had picked up German fighter formations taking off in force. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, they were climbing fast, their pilots already plotting attack angles and timing their runs to coincide with the bomber's approach. Inside the tail turret, Halpern adjusted his heated gloves and tightened the straps of his harness. The plexiglass dome around him offered a panoramic view of the sky, a strange, serene vantage point for what was about to become a deadly contest. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and bitterly cold. Frost gathered on the metal seams of the turret, and every breath formed a ghostly plume that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. He scanned the distance through the twin handles of his guns, his eyes trained to pick out anything that didn't belong. A sudden glint of sunlight, a dark speck against the pale blue, a vapor trail cutting a sharper angle than the rest. Fighters forming at 5 o'clock high came the call from one of the other ships in the formation. Seconds later, another voice crackled through the intercom. Multiple groups. Repeat, multiple groups. Looks like 24, maybe more. Halpern spotted them moments later. Faint out at first, then growing larger and sharper as they closed the distance. They were coming in fast, riding the sun to blind the gunners below. The contrails arced downward in shallow curves, splitting and reforming as the German pilots adjusted their attack paths. It was a textbook interception, coordinated, deliberate, and deadly. The first wave struck from the front. Messerschmitt Bf 109s dove steeply through formation, their cannon shells exploding in white puffs against the bombers' noses. One B-17 took a direct hit and veered sharply out of line, flames licking along its right wing before it dropped away into the clouds below. A second wave followed from above and behind, Focke-Wulf FW 190 screaming in from the high 6 o'clock position, firing in short, precise bursts. The sky erupted into chaos, tracers crisscrossing in red and orange arcs, engine smoke trailing like ribbons, chunks of aluminum skin peeling away from shattered fuselages. Halpern opened fire as the first fighter crossed into range. The twin Brownings roared, vibrating the turret so violently that his teeth rattled. He tracked the enemy's movement with short, disciplined bursts, walking his rounds toward the nose of the aircraft. At that speed and distance, a hit was almost a matter of chance, but even a near miss could force the pilot to break off. The fighter banked sharply away, disappearing beneath the bomber's tail, but another quickly filled its place. There was no shortage of targets now. The intercom was a constant barrage of noise. Reports of hits, of fires, of men bailing out. A waist gunner on a nearby ship was down. A top turret had jammed 2 planes over. A formation leader had lost 2 engines but was still holding course. It was a storm of violence, and Halpern's world narrowed to the seconds between trigger pulls, the subtle corrections of his aim, and the constant search for new threats. A pair of FW 190s approached low and fast, slipping beneath the arc of the tail guns before pulling up sharply into a climbing attack. Halpern swung the turret downward, trying to catch them to climb, but they were too quick. Their cannon fire raked the underside of the bomber, punching holes in the bomb bay doors and leaving a trail of jagged metal in their wake. The plane shuddered violently, dipping for a moment before the pilot wrestled it level again. "We're hit but holding," came Whitaker's calm voice over the intercom. "Tail, eyes open. They're coming back around." Halpern barely had time to respond before another formation of German fighters swooped in from beam, their guns flashing as they slashed through the group. Another bomber exploded in midair, a blinding flash followed by a blossom of smoke and debris. Parachutes unfurled in the distance, their silk canopies stark white against the darkening sky. The attack lasted minutes, but it felt like hours. The formation was battered, but still intact. The bombers lumbered forward, engines straining, wings riddled with holes. Yet the fighters showed no sign of relenting. They regrouped in the distance, forming up for another pass. Halpern's ammunition was running low, and the barrels of his guns were hot enough to burn through gloves. He wiped the frost from his glass, searching for any sign of weakness in their pattern, any detail he could use. That was when the thought first came, a flicker of possibility at the edge of desperation. Watching the German fighters circle, he noticed how they adjusted their approach based on his fire, how they shifted position when they believed the tail was still combat effective. It wasn't just bullets they reacted to, it was behavior. And behavior, Halpern realized, could be manipulated. The idea wasn't fully formed yet, but it was there, taking shape amid the noise and fire. If he couldn't match their speed or their numbers, maybe he could make them see what he wanted them to see. It was a thought born not from confidence, but from the cold clarity of a man who knew the next pass might be their last. The battle over the Ruhr had devolved into chaos, and chaos had a strange way of sharpening the mind. Every instinct James Halpern had honed through training, every reflex drilled into him by endless hours on a range, told him to conserve ammunition, to shoot only when sure of a hit, to hold steady and wait for the next wave. But instinct alone was not going to save them now. The Luftwaffe had the advantage in numbers and altitude, and they were exploiting every predictable reaction from the bomber crews. They knew when the tail guns would open up. They knew how long it took to reload. They even knew how to bait the Americans into firing too soon. And Halpern, watching them circle like hawks, realized that the rules he'd been taught no longer applied. It began with a small observation. During the last pass, he noticed 2 German fighters break away from their approach at the last moment, climbing sharply and banking off rather than committing to the attack. The reason was subtle but unmistakable. They had shifted targets. Instead of going after the lucky lady, they had veered toward AB 17 2 positions to the left, one that was firing erratically and violently, its tracers sweeping the sky in seemingly random arcs. The Germans didn't know whether that bomber had multiple gunners still active or whether it had heavier weaponry, but they weren't willing to risk a frontal assault to find out. That sliver of hesitation was all Halpern needed to see. Fear, or at least uncertainty, could be as potent as firepower. The idea formed quickly, but carrying it out would be something else entirely. It required breaking almost every rule he had been taught. Rather than steady, measured bursts, he began firing in uneven patterns, long, wasteful streams followed by sudden silence. Short staccato bursts aimed not at targets, but at empty sky. He deliberately shifted the angle of his turret in unpredictable ways, sometimes swinging wide as if tracking multiple aircraft, sometimes holding steady as though confident of a kill shot. The goal was not to hit anything. The goal was to look dangerous, to seem unstable, unpredictable, like a bomb with more guns than it really had, or a crew that had spotted threats others hadn't. Then he took the deception a step further. During a brief lull between passes, Halpern grabbed a small scrap of metal from the floor, a jagged piece of torn fuselage plating that had shaken loose from one of the cannon hits. He wedged it into the turret's exterior near one of the gun barrels, angling it so that it caught the sunlight and flashed as the turret moved. From a distance, it might look like an additional gun muzzle or the glint of a gun sight, anything to make the tale of the lucky lady seem more formidable than it was. But the riskiest part of his plan was yet to come. As the next wave of fighters began to line up their attack, Halpern did something that bordered on madness. He stopped firing altogether. The guns fell silent, and for a few tense moments he simply tracked the incoming aircraft without firing a shot. To the German pilots, it would look as though the tail guns were out of commission, damaged, or empty. It was the oldest bait in aerial warfare, a wounded animal inviting a kill. It worked. A trio of FW-190s broke formation and dove straight for the lucky lady, convinced they had an easy target. They closed fast, their guns flashing as they lined up for a finishing strike. Halpern waited, hands poised over the triggers, heart hammering in his chest. At 400 yards, he still didn't fire. At 300, he held. At 200, dangerously close now, he unleashed both Brownings in a torrent of tracer fire. The sudden eruption of bullets startled the lead fighter, which jerked upward too late. The burst caught its wingtip, sending it spinning out of control. The other two broke formation instinctively, their confidence shattered. The silence, the unpredictability, the illusion of vulnerability, it all combined into a deception more effective than any barrage of bullets. On their next pass, the German pilots didn't come as close. They fired from a distance, hesitated, and ultimately broke off sooner than before. Halpern had changed the dynamic. He wasn't just defending his bomber anymore. He was shaping the battle, forcing the enemy to react to him. Inside the fuselage, the crew didn't fully grasp what he was doing. They only knew that something had shifted. The attacks weren't as aggressive now. The fighters were probing cautiously, second-guessing themselves, wasting precious time that might have been spent pressing the assault. Halpern didn't explain it over the intercom. There was no time, and no guarantee it would work again, but he felt a subtle shift in momentum. In that frozen glass bubble, a farm boy from Kansas had stumbled onto a principle that no manual had ever taught him. The enemy's perception was a weapon too, and if he could manipulate it, if he could make them doubt what they saw, he might just keep the lucky lady in the air long enough to make it home. The sky had become a living thing, a roiling, violent expanse where every second demanded a decision. By now, James Halpern's pulse had slowed into a strange, focused rhythm. The fear was still there, crawling somewhere deep beneath the surface, but it no longer ruled his actions. He had tasted the power of deception in the previous pass, seen with his own eyes how behavior could shape an enemy's choices as much as bullets could. Now, he was ready to push that idea further. What he was about to attempt went beyond anything taught in training or doctrine. It was improvisation born of desperation, a performance stage in the thin, freezing air, with life and death as the stakes. The next wave of fighters approached low from the starboard side, splitting into two groups as they climbed into firing position. Halpern swung his turret toward them and opened fire, but not with the steady, measured bursts he had been taught. Instead, he fired in uneven intervals, short, panic strings followed by complete silence, then sudden, furious volleys that stitched the sky in random patterns. To the German pilots, watching from hundreds of yards away, It would appear as though more than one gunner was operating the tail. The unpredictable rhythm of the tracers suggested multiple operators shifting targets independently, a signal that the bomber's defenses were not only functional but aggressive. Then, just as abruptly, the tail guns went silent. Halpern shifted the turret erratically, sweeping across empty air, angling high as if tracking a threat above the formation. He swung low, then far to port, then back to dead astern, creating the illusion of multiple threats being engaged at once. Through the thin glass, he saw hesitation ripple through the approaching fighters. Two broke formation and pulled upward, clearly unsure whether they were flying into overlapping fields of fire. Another held back, circling wide and waiting for his wingmen to commit. Those precious seconds of doubt were worth more than any number of bullets. Halpern decided to add one more layer to the ruse. He unclipped a small reflective panel from the emergency signaling kit beside his seat, a tool meant to catch the attention of search planes if they were ever forced down. Timing his movements between bursts of gunfire, he waved the panel briefly toward the sky, then ducked back into position. From the perspective of the enemy pilots, the sudden flash might look like a signal, perhaps a coded communication to nearby escort fighters or a coordination light for friendly cover. It was impossible to know how they would interpret it, but the uncertainty was exactly the point. The effect was immediate. One of the FW-190s in the lead element wavered, then banked away altogether, abandoning its attack run. Another held its fire until the last possible second, then pulled back before ever crossing into range. Halpern grinned behind his oxygen mask. The fighters were reading meaning into everything he did. Every erratic turret swing, every break in the firing pattern, every flash of reflected light. They were fighting ghosts, reacting to threats that didn't exist. The radio chatter confirmed what his eyes were already telling him. "They're hesitating," called one of the waist gunners. "They're not pressing like before." Even the pilot, who had been fighting to keep the wounded bomber steady, noticed a shift. "Whatever you're doing back there, Red," Whitaker said over the intercom, "keep doing it." But the deception required discipline. It couldn't be overused or it would lose its effect. Halpern alternated between aggression and passivity, deliberately breaking the pattern before the enemy could read it. One pass, he let loose a wall of tracer fire that forced a Messerschmitt to roll away at the last second. The next, he held his fire until a fighter was nearly within striking distance, only to unleash a sun barrage that scattered the entire formation. At times, he tracked empty sky, pretending to follow targets beyond visual range. Other times, he let the turret hang motionless, daring the enemy to guess whether the tail guns were operational at all. The Germans, accustomed to predictable responses, found themselves second-guessing every decision. Their attack runs grew sloppier, their formations looser. Some fired from too far away, their cannon shells falling harmlessly short. Others refused to commit to close-range passes, circling and repositioning instead of diving straight in. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and with each pass that failed to land a decisive blow, the fighter's confidence seemed to erode. Halpern's actions rippled beyond his own bomber. Planes in formation around the Lucky Lady reported lighter pressure from rear, their tail gunners able to conserve ammunition and focus on fewer threats. The deception was not just protecting his own crew, it was subtly shifting the balance of the entire engagement. Somewhere in the distance, a squadron of P-51 Mustangs was racing to rendezvous with the formation. The bombers only needed to survive a little longer before the balance of power would tilt in their favor. Halpern didn't know how many minutes they had to hold out, but he knew one thing with certainty. The enemy was no longer fighting on their own terms. They were reacting to illusions, to feints, to the phantom firepower of a single tail gunner who refused to play by the rules. In that frozen turret, amid the smoke and roar and chaos, Halpern had turned the bomber's weakest point into its most unpredictable weapon. What had begun as a desperate gamble had evolved into a psychological battle, one he was winning 1 second of hesitation at a time. And as the German fighters pulled back once more, circling warily instead of diving headlong into the fight, the crew of the Lucky Lady knew they were still alive because of one man's dangerous, improvised dance with deception. The fight had raged for nearly an hour, though to men aboard the Lucky Lady it felt like a lifetime suspended in thin, frigid air. Every nerve had been stretched taut, every second another gamble against the odds. The air still smelled faintly of cordite and burned oil, and the metal skin of the bomber was scarred and pitted from near misses and cannon bursts. They had watched other fortresses spiral earthward in flames, seen parachutes bloom and vanish beneath them, and felt the concussive thud of explosions that rattled every rib of the airframe. Yet, somehow, they were still aloft. And now, as Halpern swung his turret in a slow, sweeping arc across the horizon, something began to change. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. The fighters that had been circling with the precision of vultures were suddenly less aggressive. Their coordinated waves lost some of their timing. A pair of Messerschmitts that had been positioning for a beam attack broke off early, climbing sharply and disappearing into a patch of cloud. A formation of FW-190s lined up for a head-on pass, but peeled away before closing to firing range. At first, the crew assumed it was a regrouping maneuver, a momentary pause before the final push that would finish them off. But the pause stretched into minutes, and then the minutes into a silence none of them trusted. "Where the hell did they go?" came the voice of Corporal Finch, the waist gunner, over the intercom. His tone was disbelieving, edged with adrenaline that hadn't yet worn off. "I've got nothing on my side. Not a damn thing." "Same here," the top turret gunner called back. "They're pulling back. I don't see a single one within a mile." Halpern didn't answer. He was too busy scanning every quadrant of the sky, half expecting a sudden dive from above or a surprise attack from behind. But there was nothing. Only the slow drift of contrails dispersing into the cold air and the distant glint of sunlight on empty wings. The enemy had vanished. The realization spread through the bomber like a wave. First confusion, then disbelief, then a cautious, stunned relief. They had been marked for destruction, a straggler with engine damage in a thinning formation, easy prey for a force that outnumbered them 3-1. Every manual, every after-action report, every mission debrief said the same thing. Bombers in their situation rarely made a home. Yet here they were, engines coughing but still turning, altitude dropping but still stable. The enemy gone without explanation. Even the pilot, Lieutenant Whitaker, couldn't make sense of it. "I don't know what happened back there," he said into the intercom, his voice equal parts amazement and suspicion. "But I'm not asking questions. Let's just get this bird home." They held formation for another 30 minutes, wary of a renewed assault, but it never came. The skies remained clear as they crossed back over the Rhine, then over the Dutch coast, and finally out over the choppy expanse of the North Sea. The tension that had gripped the crew for hours began to ease. Shoulders slumped. Hands shook as the adrenaline drained away. Men who had barely spoken during the worst of the battle now traded nervous jokes, each one punctuated by the same unspoken question. How had they survived? When the Lucky Lady finally touched down on the wet, wind-swept runway at Thorpe Abbot's, the ground crews expected the worst. They had watched too many crippled bombers limp home, their fuselages shredded, their crews carried out under blankets. But the Lucky Lady rolled to a stop with only superficial damage, punctures in the bomb bay doors, a few scorch panels, a hydraulic line ruptured but manageable. The maintenance chief ran a gloved hand along the fuselage and whistled softly. "She's got more luck than she deserves," he muttered. The debriefing that followed was one of the strangest the group intelligence officers had ever conducted. Halpern and the rest of the crew described the ferocity of the initial assault, the near-constant pressure, and then the inexplicable withdrawal. The intelligence men pressed for details. Had they seen escort fighters approaching? Had they intercepted any radio traffic? Had the German planes shown signs of mechanical issues or fuel shortages? But the answers were all the same: no, no, and no. One moment they were surrounded. The next, the enemy was gone. The only detail that stood out came from the gunners' observations. They spoke of strange, erratic movements from the tail turret, of how the fighters seemed hesitant, uncertain, as though they were facing more firepower than they expected. Halpern mentioned the reflective flashes, the unpredictable bursts of gunfire, the deliberate silences. The intelligence officers listened carefully, scribbling notes, but they exchanged skeptical glances. Deception at that level wasn't part of standard bomber tactics. Still, Something had clearly unsettled the enemy, and whatever it was had saved the lucky lady from destruction. In the weeks that followed, analysts combed through radio intercepts and Luftwaffe reports, but no clear explanation emerged. Some theorized that the German fighters had received orders to withdraw for fuel. Others suggested they mistook the bomber group for a heavily escorted formation. But among the crews who had witnessed it firsthand, a different story took hold. One about a 19-year-old farm boy in a tail turret who had turned a few scraps of metal and a handful of tricks into a weapon powerful enough to send the Luftwaffe packing. For James Halpern and his crewmates, it didn't matter whether the intelligence officers ever figured out. What mattered was that they had landed together, that they had beaten impossible odds, and that a mission destined to end in disaster had instead ended with boots on English soil and the taste of cold ground beneath their feet. The lucky lady was back, and her survival would puzzle those who studied the mission for months. A quiet mystery written across the skies of Germany, born from one gunner's refusal to die by the book. In the years after the war, when the guns had gone silent and the skies over Europe were once again filled with civilian aircraft instead of swarms of fighters and bombers, a different kind of battle began. One fought not with bullets or bombs, but with questions. Allied intelligence officers, historians, and former airmen pored over mission records, flight logs, and after-action reports, searching for answers to the mysteries that still linger from those desperate years. Among them was the strange case of the March 1944 Magdeburg raid, and the bomber crews who had walked away from what should have been certain annihilation. The lucky lady's story, and the inexplicable withdrawal of the German fighters that had surrounded it, remained a topic of fascination long after the last victory parades had ended. It wasn't until captured Luftwaffe pilots began speaking freely, often during lengthy interrogations in Allied run camps, that the first hints of an explanation emerged. One of the most revealing interviews came from Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Bremer, a seasoned Bf-109 pilot, with over 80 combat sorties to his name. Bremer had been part of the interception group that engaged the bomber stream over the Ruhr that day. There was something strange about that one, he recalled decades later, referring to the lucky lady. It did not behave like the others. Its fire was irregular, undisciplined, and too heavy for a single gunner. We believe it carried a new tail-mounted weapon, perhaps a twin autocannon. None of us wanted to be the first to find out. Others echoed his impressions. Feldwebel Otto Riedel, a Focke-Wulf pilot, described the unnerving sight of the bomber's tail turret swinging wildly between targets. It looked as if there were 3 or 4 gunners back there, he explained. We saw muzzle flashes from different angles, and the fire pattern made no sense. We assumed it was crossfire from multiple stations or a trap designed to bait us in close. Riedel admitted that he aborted 2 separate attack runs after misinterpreting the movements of the tail guns. I thought we were flying into a kill zone. It was not worth losing men and aircraft over one bomber. Such comments revealed just how deeply Halpern's improvisation had penetrated the enemy's decision-making process. German fighter pilots were not reckless by nature. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a losing war in the air, and every aircraft and every pilot was a precious resource. Fuel shortages plagued every squadron, limiting flight time and reducing the number of interception sorties they could launch. Replacement parts were scarce, and newer Allied aircraft like the P-51 Mustang were cutting down veteran pilots faster than they could be replaced. Under such conditions, the Luftwaffe's calculus had shifted. Risking heavy losses against what appeared to be a heavily armed bomber or a formation about to be reinforced by escorts was no longer acceptable. Some pilots admitted they believed the erratic turret movements and reflective flashes meant that American fighters were already in the vicinity. Hauptmann Franz Kruger, a formation leader who flew that day, explained how visual cues shaped their decisions. When we saw the turret tracking in all directions, we assumed that the bomber was communicating with escorts, he said. The flashes looked like signal mirrors. It is a common technique to coordinate interception counterattacks. We believed Mustangs were near. He paused before adding, if fighters were indeed present, remaining in the area would have been suicide. We chose to disengage and regroup. The interviews also exposed another layer of psychology at work, the influence of fear and uncertainty in a theater where the balance of power had shifted. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost many of its best pilots, replaced by men with only a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. They were flying older, sometimes under-maintained aircraft with fewer resources and dwindling support. Against the vast industrial power of the United States, they were increasingly outmatched, and any hint of a trap or unexpected resistance often prompted withdrawal rather than risk. Halpern's deception had exploited that mindset perfectly. The intelligence officers who compiled these accounts were fascinated by how small, improvised actions had produced such disproportionate results. There had been no new weapon aboard the Lucky Lady, no hidden escort wing waiting just beyond the clouds. The bomber's tail armament was standard, its defensive crew no larger than usual. And yet, to the men attacking it, the evidence suggested otherwise. They had seen patterns that weren't there, inferred threats that did not exist, and made decisions based on illusions born from Halpern's desperate improvisation. What had been, to one 19-year-old tail gunner, a series of instinctive gambits had, in the minds of trained enemy pilots, become a credible indication of overwhelming firepower and impending danger. It was a striking demonstration of how perception shaped combat, how a war could be influenced not only by hardware and tactics, but by fear, interpretation, and the stories men told themselves in the heat of battle. By the time those interviews were archived and analyzed, the war was over and the skies were at peace. Yet the lesson they revealed would echo in military thinking for decades to come. It showed that deception, even at the smallest scale, could bend the will of an enemy far more effectively than brute force. And it explained, at last, how a battered B-17, alone and outnumbered over Germany, had been left untouched by opponents who believed, with complete conviction, that attacking it would cost them everything. Word of what had happened over Magdeburg traveled slowly at first, carried in the half-whispered conversations of men who had been there and seen it for themselves. Bomber crews talked among themselves during evening briefings at mess hall tables or while cleaning weapons after mission. They spoke of a single B-17 that should have been torn apart by the Luftwaffe, but wasn't, of fighters that circled like wolves and then inexplicably melted away. And though no official report mentioned it by name, everyone seemed to know the story of the Lucky Lady and its 19-year-old tail gunner who had done something no one had ever tried before. Halpern himself said little. He wasn't the type to seek attention, and the crew didn't fully understand the extent of what he had done until much later. But stories have a way of growing wings in wartime, and within weeks his actions had become a kind of legend. At first, they were retold with skepticism. Some kid in the tail scared off a whole fighter wing? Sounded a load of nonsense. One waistgunner was overheard saying during a debrief in early April. But then, as more accounts surfaced and more crews confirmed the details, skepticism gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to experimentation. The first to imitate Halpern's tactics were other tail gunners in the 100 Bomb Group, men who had flown alongside the Lucky Lady and seen how her behavior in combat had unsettled the enemy. They began to fire their guns in deliberately irregular bursts instead of measured ones, breaking the neat patterns the Luftwaffe had learned to predict. Some shifted their turrets in seemingly chaotic ways, sweeping across empty sky, or tracking targets that weren't there. A few even used reflective surfaces, pocket mirrors, polished shell casings, signal panels, to flash light into the air, hoping to suggest communications with invisible escorts. The results were inconsistent but intriguing. On some missions, enemy fighters hesitated or pulled back earlier than expected. On others, they made hasty, poorly coordinated attack runs, clearly uncertain about the formation's defenses. Intelligence officers noticed a shift but had no official explanation for it. One analysis from April 1944 simply noted that enemy pilots are displaying increased caution and reluctance to commit to close engagements. What it didn't say, though many crews knew it, was that the change was a product of dozens of small, unofficial experiments inspired by one man's improvisation. The phenomenon spread beyond the 100th Bomb Group, word passed informally between units on neighboring airfields. Ground crews overheard in the hangars, navigators swapped stories in the ready rooms, and gunners compared notes while lining up for chow. Soon, crews in the 390th, the 303rd, and the 91st were trying their own variations on Halpern's deception. Some began transmitting bursts of fake radio chatter, mimicking the coded language used by escort fighters to give the impression that help was nearby. Others experimented with stagger formation shifts, subtly altering the spacing of their aircraft mid-mission to make it appear as though additional bombers were joining the stream. Waist gunners, usually limited to defensive fire, sometimes unleashed long, wild bursts into empty air before the enemy arrived, not to hit anything, but to convince observers that the formation was bristling with active guns. None of this was sanctioned by official doctrine. In fact, Bomber Command discouraged anything that deviated from standard procedure. But in the air, far from the white bars and diagrams of training manuals, survival mattered more than rules. Crews learned that deception was not a replacement for firepower. It was a multiplier. It confused the enemy, disrupted their timing, and forced them to make decisions based on incomplete or misleading information. In a war where seconds often determined whether a crew lived or died, those small delays could mean everything. There were reports, unconfirmed but widely believed, of Luftwaffe pilots calling off attacks because they believed they were flying into ambushes. One after-action report described a squadron of fighters disengaging after intercepting what they thought was a coded transmission indicating P-51 escorts were near. Another told of a bomber group that suffered no losses on a deep penetration raid after adopting deliberately erratic firing patterns and stage formation adjustments. Whether or not these outcomes were directly linked to deception, the crews believed they were, and belief was enough to fuel the spread of the practice. By the summer of 1944, Halpern's unorthodox tactics had become part of the shared folklore of the 8th Air Force. They were never written down in official manuals, never briefed in training lectures, and never formally acknowledged in mission debriefings. Yet every seasoned crew knew about them, and many quietly incorporated some form of deception into their missions. It was a subtle but profound shift in how bomber crews approached their work. They were no longer just flying fortresses relying on brute defensive firepower. They were learning to fight a psychological war in the sky, shaping the enemy's decisions before a single trigger was pulled. For Halpern, the quiet spread of his idea was both humbling and surreal. He had never intended to start a new tactic or influence the way an air campaign was fought. All he had wanted was to bring his crew home alive. But that desperate improvisation over Magdeburg had grown into something larger, a lesson shared from one bomber to the next, passed along not through official orders but through whispers, stories, and the unspoken understanding that in the unforgiving air war over Europe, sometimes the best weapon wasn't a gun at all but an illusion. When the war ended and the dust of Europe finally began to settle, men in uniforms traded their flight suits for classrooms and briefing rooms. Historians, strategists, and analysts sifted through mission records and combat reports, trying to understand not just how the Allies had won, but why. In the midst of those countless pages of data, sortie numbers, bomb loads, kill ratios, a small number of incidents stood out as anomalies, moments where outcomes seemed to defy the expected balance of firepower and numbers. Among them was the story of a single B-17, badly damaged and outnumbered, that had inexplicably driven off a superior Luftwaffe force over Magdeburg. At first, it was treated as a curiosity, a footnote in the vast history of the air war. But as the details became clearer, military thinkers began to see it as something more, an early, accidental example of a concept that would later become a cornerstone of modern strategy: behavioral deception. Behavioral deception was not about weapons or hardware. It was about shaping the enemy's understanding of a situation, manipulating how they interpreted what they saw, and turning that perception into a tool of war. In Halpern's case, the enemy's retreat had nothing to do with increased firepower or technological superiority. It was a result of carefully crafted illusions, inconsistent firing patterns, misleading turret movements, flashes that suggested coordination with escorts, and the calculated display of apparent vulnerability followed by sudden aggression. Each action on its own seemed trivial, but together they told a story the Luftwaffe pilots believed. It was a story of overwhelming defenses, hidden support, and risks too great to justify continuing the fight. Analysts would later connect Halpern's improvisation to a long lineage of deception in warfare. Naval commanders, for example, had used dummy ships and false radio transmissions for centuries. During World War I and II, fleets deployed Q-ships, merchant vessels disguised as unarmed cargo carriers that revealed hidden armaments only when enemy submarines approached within range. The deception was not about defeating the enemy with superior firepower, but about luring them into making mistakes based on false assumptions. Halpern's ruse worked on the same principle. By distorting the information available to the enemy pilots, by making them see more guns than existed, more coordination than was real, he forced them to recalculate their risk and make decisions in his favor. The concept found even deeper resonance in psychological operations. In North Africa, the Allies had famously used inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fake supply depots to convince Axis commanders of phantom armies. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception preceding D-Day, relied entirely on false narratives. Dummy paratroopers dropped far from Normandy, fictional radio chatter from non-existent units, and even a fabricated general's headquarters to mislead German intelligence. Halpern's actions in the sky were a microcosm of that same idea. He had, in essence, staged a miniature version of a psychological operation within a single aerial engagement, crafting a false reality convincing enough to change enemy behavior. What made his improvisation remarkable, analysts argued, was that it occurred spontaneously, without planning or support. Most deception campaigns required weeks or months of preparation. Halpern had mere seconds to act, and yet he instinctively grasped the underlying principle, that the enemy's mind was as much a battlefield as the sky itself. He weaponized perception, one postal report concluded, and in doing so demonstrated that the most potent defense may sometimes be nothing more than a believable lie. The lessons drawn from that mission would echo far beyond the context of bomber formations and tail turrets. In the early years of the Cold War, deception became a strategic discipline in its own right. Both superpowers invested heavily in manipulating perceptions, disguising the size of their arsenals, concealing technological capabilities, and creating illusions of strength or weakness to influence each other's decisions. American B 47 bomber patrol routes were deliberately varied to create uncertainty about deployment patterns. Soviet missile parades often featured mock-ups designed to exaggerate the scale of their arsenal. Even space launches were sometimes timed or announced in ways meant to mislead observers about capabilities and intentions. At its core, all of these strategies relied on the same principle Halpern had stumbled upon in his turret: the recognition that warfare is as much about what the enemy thinks you can do as it is about what you can actually do. If you can convince an opponent that a trap awaits them, they may retreat without ever confirming its existence. If you can make them believe their position is weaker than it is, they may negotiate from disadvantage. If you can distort their picture of reality, even slightly, you have already seized the initiative. For the men who studied these lessons, Halpern's actions were more than a wartime anecdote. They were a proof of concept, a demonstration that even the smallest, most improvised acts of deception could have strategic consequences. They showed that innovation did not always come from laboratories or war rooms. Sometimes it came from a cold plexiglass bubble at 25,000 feet, where a 19-year-old gunner, armed with instinct and desperation, rewrote the rules of aerial combat without ever meaning to. And as militaries around the world build entire doctrines on the manipulation of perception in the decades to come, they will be unknowingly following in the footsteps of a farm boy from Kansas who, for one extraordinary mission, made the Luftwaffe believe a lie, and lived to tell the tale because of it. When the war ended and the noise of engines and gunfire faded into memory, James Halpern did what many young men of his generation did. He went home. There were no parades waiting for him in Kansas, no newspaper headlines, no medals pinned to his chest by generals. He stepped off the train in a plain wool coat and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, greeted by the same wind-swept wheat fields he had left behind. His parents hugged him tightly and asked few questions. The farm needed work. The tractor was still temperamental, and life, the ordinary, unremarkable kind, went on. For Halpern, that was enough. He had survived. That alone felt like victory. He never saw himself as a hero. In his mind, he had only done what anyone else in his position would have tried to do: think fast, act smart, and get his crew home alive. The story of the Magdeburg raid, of the deception that had scattered a formation of enemy fighters, was rarely mentioned outside of mission debriefings. When neighbors asked about the war, he would talk about the weather over Germany or the cold inside a bomber's fuselage, but he never mentioned the day he turned illusion into a weapon. Even his parents died without knowing the full story. It was easier, he once said in a rare interview decades later, to let people believe he had just kept his head down and done his job. But among those who had flown with him, the men who had felt the bombers shudder under cannon fire and smelled the burning oil in the air, his name was not forgotten. In the pubs of East Anglia, where veterans gathered over warm beer in the years after the war, the story of the tail gunner who bluffed the Luftwaffe became part of the folklore of the 8th Air Force. It was told and retold, always with a hint of awe and a touch of disbelief. Some swore that Halpern had tricked an entire fighter wing into believing a bomber was bristling with experimental guns. Others claimed he had convinced the Germans that a squadron of P-51s was about to descend on them. The details shifted with each telling, but the core of the story remained. A 19-year-old farm boy had outwitted some of the best pilots in the world with nothing but his wits and a pair of machine guns. As the decades passed, that story became something larger than the man himself. At reunions and commemorative gatherings, Halpern's name was spoken with a kind of reverence, not for the number of planes he had shot down. In truth, no one knew how many, if any, he had, but for what his actions symbolized. In a war defined by vast industrial machines and overwhelming firepower, he had proven that intelligence and creativity could still shape the outcome of battle. His was a reminder that not every victory was measured in tonnage dropped or enemy aircraft destroyed. Sometimes survival itself was a triumph, and survival often depended on the courage to think differently when it mattered most. Halpern, for his part, remained humble. He married, raised children, and eventually took over the family farm. When asked about the war by his grandchildren, he spoke more about the camaraderie of his crew than the combat. He described the endless hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror, the jokes shared over static-filled intercoms, and the taste of lukewarm coffee poured into tin cups at 20,000 feet. The trick, as others called it, was just one of many decisions he had made in a situation where there were no good options. "We were all improvising," he told a historian in the 1970s. "I just happened to get lucky." Yet his legacy endured, growing in quiet ways he never intended. In Air Force training schools, instructors reference his mission as an example of adaptive thinking under fire. Military academies use it as a case study in psychology of deception. Even as technology advanced and warfare became more mechanized, his story continued to resonate. Proof that the human mind, not just a machine, was a decisive weapon. Halpern passed away in the early 1990s, long after most of his crew had done the same. At his funeral, a handful of surviving veterans gathered at the edge of the cemetery. They wore faded bomber jackets and carried photographs from a war that had shaped their youth. One of them, a former pilot, placed a single-spent .50 caliber casing on a headstone and saluted. "You saved more lives than you ever knew," he said quietly. To outsiders, James Halpern's life might have seemed ordinary. A farmer, a husband, a father who returned from war and never sought the spotlight. But to those who had flown beside him, his name meant something far more profound. He was proof that ingenuity could hold its own against overwhelming odds, that a man with no special rank or training could change the course of battle through creativity alone. In the skies over Germany, a boy from Kansas had written a lesson that would outlast the war itself. That courage was not just a will to fight, but the courage to think differently when fighting was no longer enough. And in that way, Halpern's story passed from memory into legend, carried forward not by official histories or medals, but by the men who had lived because of it. In the decades that followed the Second World War, the nature of aerial warfare changed almost beyond recognition. Propellers gave way to jet engines, bombers grew faster and more complex, and the battlefield of the future stretched into stratosphere and beyond. Yet even as the technology evolved, one lesson from the war's bloodiest skies endured: the understanding that what an enemy believes can be as decisive as what you can actually do. That idea, first proven in the freezing tail turret of a battered B-17 over Magdeburg, became a quiet cornerstone of modern air doctrine. James Halpern had not known it at the time, but his improvised deception had started a chain reaction that would ripple through every era of military strategy that followed. The first evidence of its influence emerged almost immediately after the war. As the U.S. Air Force was established in 1947, strategists revisited countless combat reports from the 8th Air Force and other bomber groups. Amid the statistics on losses and kill ratios, one recurring insight began to surface. Confusion, uncertainty, and false information could shape an aerial engagement as powerfully as superior firepower. The conclusion was subtle but profound. Deception could no longer be treated as an afterthought. It needed to be woven into the fabric of air strategy itself. By the 1950s, this concept was becoming institutionalized. Bomber Command experimented with radar decoys, small, expendable drones that mimicked the radar signature of AB-47 or B-52, designed to draw enemy interceptors and surface-to-air missiles away from the real strike force. These ghost bombers were an extension of the principle Halpern had demonstrated. They didn't destroy the enemy's weapons, but they manipulated where those weapons were aimed. Around the same time, electronic countermeasures became a standard feature of strategic bombers. Jamming pods, shaft dispensers, and false transponders were deployed not just to block enemy sensors, but to feed them misleading data, creating phantom formations, false altitude readings, and deceptive flight paths. The Cold War's escalating technological rivalry only deepened the emphasis on perception as a weapon. During the tense days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, two reconnaissance flights over the island employed radar-reflective pods designed to mislead Soviet tracking stations about their altitude and speed. Later, State Route 71 Blackbird missions incorporated deliberate radio silence breaks and censored jamming patterns to make Soviet radar operators believe they were seeing multiple aircraft instead of one. All of these techniques, in their essence, were modern evolutions of the principle Halpern had stumbled upon at 25,000 feet. Confuse the enemy, overload their decision-making, and force them to act on false assumptions. Even the development of stealth technology, perhaps the most transformative advance in post-war aviation, bore the fingerprints of this idea. Engineers and tacticians alike understood that stealth was not merely about making aircraft invisible, but about shaping the enemy's perception of what was and was not a threat. A radar operator who could not distinguish between a real bomber and background noise was no different from a Luftwaffe pilot in 1944 who could not tell whether a tail gunner's erratic fire was real or staged. The principle was identical. When the enemy cannot trust their own senses, their ability to fight is diminished before the first shot is fired. Tactical deception extended beyond the realm of machines, too. Pilots were trained in signature management, altering flight profiles, using false radio calls, and simulating attacks to mask their true objectives. Entire strike packages were sometimes built around misdirection, with small groups of aircraft drawing defenses away from the actual point of attack. Exercises like Operation Sky Shield in the early 1960s, designed to test North America's air defenses, revealed that carefully orchestrated deception could allow simulated bomber forces to penetrate even the most sophisticated radar networks undetected. The influence of Halpern's legacy reached beyond the cockpit as well. Intelligence agencies, inspired by the same principles, refined aerial psychological operations into tools of geopolitical influence. Balloons carrying propaganda leaflets into hostile airspace, false reconnaissance flights intended to provoke overreactions, and electronic spoofing of enemy communications all stem from the same underlying philosophy. Manipulate the adversary's perception, and you manipulate their choices. By the late 20th century, this approach was no longer experimental. It was doctrine. The U.S. Air Force's air superiority manuals included entire sections on deception and misdirection, citing historical precedents from World War II to illustrate their effectiveness. Military theorists even coined a term for it: perception dominance. It meant shaping the adversary's view of reality so thoroughly that they acted according to your plan without realizing it. And while Halpern's name rarely appeared in those official documents, his story was well known among those who studied the psychology of warfare. It was taught not as a tale of luck or improvisation, but as a demonstration of fundamental truth about conflict in the air, the side that controls the narrative of the fight. What the enemy thinks they see, what they think they understand, often controls the outcome. From radar decoys to stealth bombers, from Cold War jamming missions to modern cyber operations, the thread could be traced back to a moment in 1944 when a young tail gunner realized that the enemy's mind was as vulnerable as their machines. In the jet age and beyond, that lesson endured. The tools grew more complex, the skies more crowded, and the stakes higher. But the essence remained unchanged. Power was not just the ability to destroy, but the ability to deceive. And in that, the boy from Kansas had been decades ahead of his time. Long after the last B-17s were grounded and the last German airfields lay silent, the story of James Halpern continued to drift like a contrail across the landscape of memory. It was not the story of a man who destroyed enemy squadrons single-handedly, nor one who racked up kills or medals. It was the story of a farm boy who, in a moment of desperation high above a foreign land, had realized something profound about the nature of war. In that plexiglass bubble at 25,000 feet, where fear and instinct collided with the brutal mathematics of survival, he had stumbled onto a truth that transcended his own small part in the conflict. Wars are not won solely by those with the largest guns or the fastest planes. They are won by those who understand the battlefield of the mind. For all the machinery that defined the Second World War, the endless assembly lines, the roaring engines, the factories that churn out planes and tanks by the thousands, it was still a deeply human struggle at its core. It was a contest of decisions made in seconds, of men adapting to the unexpected, of minds locked in a silent duel beneath the noise of combat. Halpern's trick was born not from a manual or a command, but from the raw, animal will to survive, a flash of insight forged under the weight of imminent death. And yet, that improvised act rippled outward, reshaping the thinking of airmen, commanders, and strategists for generations. It showed that creativity could level the playing field, that intellect could blunt the edge of superior force, and that imagination could become a weapon as powerful as any cannon. It is easy in hindsight to view wars as competitions of material strength. Historians tally up tonnage of bombs dropped, sorties flown, divisions deployed. But those numbers never fully explain why one side prevailed and another faltered. They cannot capture the intangible factors, fear, doubt, deception, overconfidence, that shape decisions and alter outcomes. Halpern's moment over Magdeburg was a microcosm of that larger truth. The Luftwaffe pilots that day were not defeated by superior firepower. They were defeated by uncertainty, by the sudden and unnerving suspicion that the sky around them was not what it appeared to be. This is a paradox of modern war. Even as technology advances, even as weapons grow more precise and devastating, the struggle remains fundamentally psychological. A radar screen that cannot be trusted, a formation that appears larger than it is, a signal that hints at hidden reinforcements. All of these can be as decisive as a bomb or a bullet, and each of them is an echo of the principle Halpern demonstrated with nothing more than a pair of machine guns, a scrap of reflective metal, and a refusal to accept the obvious. His legacy endures not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary, because it could have been any man in any turret, making the same desperate calculation. It speaks to something universal about conflict. That ingenuity often arises not in laboratories or command centers, but in the minds of ordinary people forced to improvise under pressure. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by grand strategies and sweeping offensives, but by small, human moments of creativity that ripple outward far beyond their original context. For the veterans who told his story in smoky pubs and reunion halls, Halpern's name became a shorthand for this deeper lesson. It was a reminder that courage is not just about holding the line or pulling the trigger. Sometimes, courage is daring to think differently when everything around you demands conformity. It is the willingness to gamble on an idea, however improbable, when the alternative is certain defeat. Today, long after his passing, the contrails of bombers have given way to the silent flight paths of drones and satellites. The battlefields stretch into cyberspace and beyond the Earth's atmosphere. Yet the principle remains unchanged. Wars are still fought and won in the uncertain space between what the enemy believes and what is real. Deception, perception, and imagination remain as potent as any arsenal. And the lesson Halpern wrote into the clouds above Germany continues to guide those who fight in new skies. Somewhere in that thin, cold air over Magdeburg, a 19-year-old boy taught the world something timeless. That even amid the machinery of modern war, the human mind remains its most unpredictable, most formidable weapon. That lesson, born from fear and instinct in the belly of a bomber, lives on, a quiet thread woven into the vast, complex tapestry of how wars are truly fought. In the end, Halpern's legacy is not just a story of survival, but a testament to the enduring truth that victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the cleverest, to those who master not only the battlefield, but the space between what is seen and what is imagined.